All right, good morning, everyone. Let's get started. Welcome to ARE Discussions. I'm Ellen Bruno. I'm a Cooperative Extension Specialist at UC Berkeley in the Department of Ag and Resource Economics. ARE Discussions is a webinar series that's open to everyone, and it's hosted. We host experts talking about a variety of economic issues that are relevant to California's ag and natural resource communities. This series is being organized by the UC Cooperative Extension economists. Brittany Goodrich and Tina Saitone are both at UC Davis. Mehdi Namadi is at UC Riverside, and myself. So our meeting's going to run for an hour and a half this morning. We're going to have guided Q&A with each of our speakers, and then we'll have Q&A from the audience at the end. So please, for those in the audience, please submit your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And towards the end of the webinar, Mehdi will ask your questions from the Q&A of our speakers, and we should have plenty of time at the end to get your questions answered. So please send those along throughout the presentation. Our seminars are being recorded, and they'll be available afterwards on our website, arediscussions.ucdavis.edu. So today we have two excellent speakers to talk about challenges facing wine growers and wineries in California. So first we have Dr. Aaron Smith. He's the Deloach Professor of Agricultural and Resource Economics at UC Davis. He researches energy and agricultural markets and is an expert on a range of economic issues affecting California crops. And today he's going to give us some background on the California wine industry and discuss various economic issues facing the industry, and sort of he's going to give us this economics perspective of some of the issues and challenges we're talking about today. And then we are fortunate to have Molly Moran Williams joining us as well, and she is going to give us more of an industry perspective. She is the Industry and Community Relations Director of the Napa Valley Grapegrowers Association. And so she's been representing the grape growing community on a host of issues relevant to the industry for over 5 years. So we're really lucky to have her sharing her perspective with us as well. Before I turn it over to Brittany, we wanted to share just briefly about a Cdfa research project. They're working with USDA and other partners to do this a statewide survey of the wildfire impacts to the wine grape industry. And so we just wanted to, for the sake of to support fellow researchers, share disseminate their survey, because they're looking for additional respondents. So they're specifically interested in hearing from wine grape growers, those who work at vineyard management companies and others that produce wine commercially. And so you can either put your phone camera up on the QR code, and that'll direct you to the survey. And we can also throw a link in the chat. And I'm sure they would really appreciate you participating. And so from here, I'll pass it off to Brittany.
All right, thanks, Ellen. So we're going to go ahead and get started with our discussion with Aaron this morning. So welcome, Aaron. Thanks for joining us. So the first question that we have is, we want to sort of have you give us a big picture view of the California wine industry. So how important is it in, a global context in terms of wine production, and then how important is it in terms of U.S. wine production?
Thanks, Brittany. And before I answer that, thanks to Brittany, Ellen, Mehdi, and Tina for inviting me here and for organizing this series. I think it's a fantastic series. And I'm looking forward today to learning something myself. I think, you know, I do a lot of different kinds of work in related to agriculture. And so I'm looking maybe at the wine industry from sort of a 30,000 foot perspective. And I'm really interested to hear also what Molly and others say who are much closer to the ground than I am. To answer Brittany's question briefly, the United States is most years the 4th or 5th largest producer of wine. I guess here this graph shows us the 5 largest producers of wine in by volume. And so Italy, France, and Spain have been for a long time the largest producers of wine by volume. The US and Argentina tend to come next. As we all know, like many specialty crops and wine included, California is the dominant producer in the United States. It is true that every state in the union has a wine industry, and I think every state in the union might be proud of their wine industry, but you know, the facts are that California grows about 85% of the nation's grapes, and even more than that by value, given the very high value wines that are produced in particular in Napa and Sonoma. So when we're thinking about sort of global wine production, we're thinking about places with Mediterranean climates. And so that's why we see places like Italy, France, and Spain near the top. We see Argentina or Chile, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and obviously, I'm from New Zealand, so I had to put New Zealand in there, and then obviously California in the United States.
All right, thanks, Aaron. Thanks for that context. So where are most of California's wine grapes produced? So we have Molly here from the Napa Valley Growers Association. So can you tell us approximately, you know, where are most of the grapes produced, and do the different regions differ in terms of wine quality?
Yes, I can do this, and I'm going to do this by jumping to my website where I have various pieces of data. So this is an app that's sitting on my website showing us California crops. And what we can see here by value of production, so starting just California wide and then digging into wine, alfalfa is the largest crop in the state by volume. It has been for quite a while. And we see these 2 purple areas here, wine and table grapes coming next. If we look more specifically at, that's almonds. We're not doing almonds today. We look specifically at wine grapes. What we see is if we want to measure value of production, we can see Napa there in green, Sonoma in red. Those are the counties. So these are county data. Those are the counties that produce the largest amount of wine by volume in the United States. You can see that light blue area is other counties. So there's a lot of other counties also that produce wine grapes, and I'll show a map soon. If instead of looking at value of production, we were to just look at harvested acreage, and I can take this back a little further, you know, what we see is that now Napa and Sonoma become a much smaller part of the picture. So we're seeing here that Napa and Sonoma are producing grapes of very high value relative to the wine grapes that are produced in, say, Fresno County, San Joaquin County, and other places in the Central Valley. If we now switch and look at price, that makes this just a little bit more clear. We're looking, you know, close to these particular graphs, and in 2019, we're looking at, you know, $6,000 a ton on average in Napa County. We're looking at $3,000 in Sonoma County, much lower values. So very different markets are being served by the production that's coming out of the Central Valley predominantly versus California. And if I can, I'll just take 1 or 2 more minutes to show you this map. This is a map based on satellite data where we can look and see where grapes are being grown. In fact, all crops. So here's a map of California, and we have various crops coded by color. And if we look carefully, we can see purple areas. So we see down here around Fresno, we see a bunch of grapes. Around Lodi, we see a bunch of grapes. And then we see these sort of more premium regions, these small valleys, Napa Valley here. We see Sonoma Valley. We see down here in Lower Salinas Valley area. a lot of where the wine grapes are being produced. So we tend to see the premium wine grapes in these sort of smaller valleys, and the larger bulk wine being in the Central Valley. And I could play around and look at these maps all day, but I won't bore everyone with that.
Thanks, Aaron. Those tools seem to be super useful. So we'll make sure that the link to that is in the chat for everyone so they can play around with it on their own. Okay, so can you tell us about some of the major challenges for winemakers and grape growers in California?
Yeah, I can. And here again, I'll be interested to hear what Molly has to say also. But as I see it, I think climate is a big challenge that's at the forefront at the moment. So in particular, I think what the changing climate is bringing to California agriculture, and in particular in grapes, which is our topic for today, is increasing drought, increasing frequency of wildfires, and we've experienced that acutely over the last few years, sort of certainly 2017, again 2019, and then last year. So that increasing frequency and severity, I didn't write that in the slide, but severity of wildfires is a huge factor, I think, for the wine industry to grapple with. We'll talk a little later about we're in a period now where prices are a little bit lower, returns were low last year, and so that's a factor that the industry, I think, is facing and sort of more long-term, maybe over the last few years. I think labor shortages have been another issue where that it makes it more difficult to operate the vineyard and harvest when it's more difficult to find labor to provide the services you need. And just in particular, looking at 2021, I saw this map online this morning. This dark brown area shows us the regions that are the driest they have been, so the driest winter since at least 1979. So this particular data is only going back to 1979. And what we can see is that this premium wine growing area that we're looking at in Northern California here, in particular, it's the driest it's been since at least 1979. And snowpack currently in the Sierra is below 50% of normal. I think we're certainly right now looking at pretty severe drought conditions here going forward over the next while.
All right, thanks, Aaron. So I know that recently you, on your Ag Data News website, you published a report called A Crushing Crush Report, which was a great name. But can you tell us what wine production has looked like in 2020, and maybe just some of the factors that have influenced that production that you see?
Yes, one of my sort of missions recently has been to try to sort of understand and dig into all the masses of data that USDA produces. One of those pieces is the crush report, which is viewed very carefully in the wine industry and came out about a month or so ago. And what we saw in that report for this past year is that there were many fewer wine grapes crushed in California than in previous years. So the total crush was down 14% from 2019, down 21% from 2018. And so, this plot here shows us some of the long-term trends, increasing of red wine, the decline of sort of table and raisin grape varieties used in wine. But what we really see is that this past year, 2020, was quite bad in terms of quantity. Now, when we're thinking about the amount of revenue you get from growing and selling grapes, quantity is one factor. Price is another factor. Prices were also low in 2020. So the crush report shows average red wine returns were 23% lower than they had been in 2019. White wine down much less, down 6%. So this was really felt acutely in red wine varieties. Even more than that, this map here shows us the percentage change in grower returns per ton, so prices, by county. So what we see here is, and counties mostly align with sort of the grape pricing regions, and so I plotted this by county rather than by the the regions. But what you see here is that, for example, Napa prices were 21% lower. So returns per ton 21% lower in 2019 than in 2018. Sonoma down 15%. The bulk wine areas in the Central Valley, if anything, their prices were a little bit higher this past year, 2020, than they had been in previous years. So we really see here a pretty big drop in returns per ton in the premium wine regions. And so why is that? I mean, I think the proximate cause you would have to say would be COVID-19, reduced premium wine sales in restaurants and tasting rooms. No one was going out to wineries. No one was going out to restaurants for a large chunk of the year. They were maybe staying home and drinking bulk wine instead. That certainly would be one factor. Early season heat last year in 2020 did reduce yields. So some of that quantity reduction that we see would be attributable to that. In addition, inventories had built up over prior years. And then a final factor that I think is that I'm actually really happy to see Cdfa is doing this project to learn about the effect of smoke taint from wildfires on the value of wine. Industry commentators and a lot of experts certainly cite it as a significant factor. I feel like my reading, and this is an economist reading the science, so you can take that for what it is. But my reading of some of the science is that maybe the really bad smoke taint is going to happen only really for vineyards that are very close to the wildfires and quite close to harvest. And so because the chemicals that really damage wine tend to dissipate within a couple of hours. And so fires that are a far distance away and the smoke travels are probably not going to have much effect on wine quality. So, to me, that suggests that maybe smoke taint was not such a big factor, given where the 2020 fires were located. I guess the Alinu complex fire was maybe on the edge of Napa Valley, but I'm really interested to see what the research discovers and what people on the ground might say about the extent to which that mattered versus other factors in 2020.
Interesting. Thanks, Aaron. Lots of different factors influencing the industry. So we've seen, you covered all of these different, things affecting grower profitability, winemaker profitability. So how can growers and winemakers actually address some of these challenges going forward?
I don't know. So I think that the climate challenges are real. And so, it's easy to say that, to expect and prepare for droughts and wildfires, but I think that's exactly what we need to do. And so I think the first step to meeting challenges is to sort of identify that these challenges are there and to prepare for them. So, whether you're thinking sort of directly about, dry grass around your property, whether you're thinking about securing water supplies, whether you're thinking about how you would manage your property in the, in presence of reduced water availability, all of those things. One thing I think that's distinctive about the climate challenges for the industry is that they're the same challenges faced by all of California agriculture, and in fact, industries around the world. And so this is not something that's very specific to wine, where you'd say, okay, this is a challenge for the wine industry. What's going to happen is that some people are going to exit the industry and they're going to start growing almonds or something. The same challenges exist there. And so I think this is a thing where we're all in it together, and as individuals, at least, that expecting and preparing for it, I think is the first step. I think low prices will, I expect a pretty strong recovery in many parts of the economy this year as we move out of the pandemic, and with that will come more interest in drinking wine and going out to fancy restaurants and other things that will bring prices up. Labor shortages are not something that I've studied too closely. I am working with the AI Institute for the Food System at UC Davis, which I think is a window into the future where I think we're looking at a lot of potential automation and artificial intelligence solutions, both on farm and in the winery, that can improve productivity, and those will also, I think, help sort of mitigate labor shortages that have been a challenge for the industry also in recent years.
All right, thanks, Aaron. That was great. So I think now we'll go ahead and turn it over to Tina and Molly. But just a reminder for everyone to, if you have any questions for Aaron or Molly, we'll enter them into the Q&A box at the bottom right-hand side of your Zoom screen, and we'll get to those in a little while. So thanks, Aaron.
Thanks so much, Brittany. And I'd like to welcome Molly Moran Williams and thank her very much for joining ARE discussions today. Molly, would you start out telling us a little bit about your background and about your position at Napa Valley Grapegrowers Association?
So NVG is a nonprofit organization with a mission to preserve and promote Napa Valley's world-class vineyards. Our primary focus is actually on education and viticultural best practices and agricultural preservation. So we do a lot of Zoom seminars right now on all things related to that. For 45 years, we've created best practices programs for growers to address a variety of sustainability issues, to manage pest and disease, to increase quality in vineyards. And we fostered a farming community that really talks to one another to address whatever issues happen to come up. So this has, been a big year for community banding together. We take scientific research and we turn it into papers, training videos, and programs, and we translate science into best practice and practical farming methods to be implemented in the field. And we've always embraced sustainability as a vital part of agricultural permanence. And so more and more we're talking about climate and what our role is in climate mitigation. And I'm, as the industry and community relations director, I kind of like hashtag I have issues. I work on anything that requires, advocacy, work on land use policy, whatever the problem is, I try to work on those solutions and work with community members and partners to find solutions.
Sure. And speaking of problems, Dr. Smith outlined some of the biggest challenges facing the industry, both grape growers and the wine industry broadly, kind of across the state. Could you speak to if there are different challenges in Napa Valley and what you're seeing based on your more regional perspective?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think in a very general way, we see the same kinds of challenges that are seen across California. Napa is a little bit different from other agricultural regions in that we have this like very specialized high value crop. I mean, we see a slightly different perspective on things like labor, for example, because our wages comparatively are very high, even for entry-level vineyard workers. And so, we draw people from other regions to come here. And I would say the largest problem we have with something like labor has to do more with the jobs housing imbalance than just the cost of living here in Napa. And so that's a major obstacle for people, being able to settle down here with their families. And it's really a problem across the spectrum, not just for vineyard workers, but certainly for vineyard workers. We've been the tip of the spear, I think, when it comes to needing to respond to severe wildfire and smoke events. Really, since 2017, we've had some level of fire or smoke event every harvest. And we're coming to terms with the fact that wildfires are, a natural part of our ecological landscape. But I do think it's important to recognize the role of climate change in all of this and what we've experienced here. The LNU fires are a perfect example of, no level of forest management could have stopped 12,000 lightning strikes from, spontaneously causing all these fires across California. And climate scientists will tell you that, this is the unseen force of climate change. The temperature changes on the ocean and temperature differentials have created weather patterns like we've never seen before in California. And, we do need to do forest management. It's super important for reducing fuel loads and preventing, wildfire severity and limiting wildfires. But we have to talk about climate change at the same time. So in that sense, we have our work cut out for us. As an organization, we're doing a lot related to climate resilience and mitigation. But in the very immediate term, I would say preventing severe wildfires and mitigating losses has become, just the #1 priority for our community, along with preventing further spread of COVID-19. And so just to quickly provide a little more context on that, the fire-related challenges we've had this year have really caused significant economic harm. I've read from one analyst that the glass fire alone could result in $2 billion worth of damages to the losses to the wine industry. And so, in our work, we've estimated hundreds of millions of dollars of crop damage due to smoke. For those that have crop insurance, coverage rarely equals full market price, and there's really no disaster relief available for someone who had losses due to smoke exposure. And then there's also no availability of property insurance for vineyards without houses on them. So you're able to get liability insurance, but no property insurance, which leaves people without a lot of financial support after disaster strikes. We've also had we've done preliminary analyses that show that vineyard workers lost an average of $5,500 per person during harvest this year. So if you multiply that by the estimated amount of vineyard workers here in Napa, you get possible losses of up to $50 million in lost wages, which is huge. And as I think was noted, a significant number of wineries, reported that they had no vintage or significantly reduced vintage. So, short list of ways that we're working on this: assigning a dedicated wildfire task force, working to better define and identify smoke taint to provide models for navigating contracts and relationships and issues around smoke exposure. We're advocating for better insurance policies and disaster relief resources and ensuring that growers will be insured. Working on our best practices programs for fire prevention and land management strategies in and around the vineyard landscape. And then we also funded a wage loss assistance program for vineyard workers in partnership with our Napa Valley Community Foundation. So I would say wildfire, climate change, two greatest challenges here in Napa.
Yeah, definitely. And so following up on that, certainly 2020 was an exceptional year for Napa and the wine industry in many ways. But specifically, media reports were suggesting that the 2020 crop had essentially 80% of wineries that would not make a vintage. Whether that production was harvested or not is kind of another question. So can you talk a little bit about how wine grape production was affected and how winemaking was affected, specifically by the fires and relatedly smoke taint?
Sure, yeah. I think it's important to remember that it takes about 3 years for, grapes to become wine, to be bottled, to end up on the market and be a glass of wine at your dinner table. So, we won't really have the full picture of how much wine was lost for a while now. We're going to be looking at that over the next several years. What I do know is that, as a consumer, you will never, you will most likely not encounter a smoke tainted wine on shelves, at least from Napa Valley, because, Napa Valley is unlikely, Napa Valley producers are unlikely to risk their reputation for high quality. And that's why so many of them took a loss this year. So we're still quantifying, but again, it's something that is mostly affecting the producers and the growers themselves, and it won't really affect what you find on the marketplace. And in terms of what happened in the picking and winemaking process this year, growers and vintners both faced a ton of risk. But growers in particular, I think, were kind of put in a particularly hard position due to the extreme deficiencies of crop insurance and sort of like a unclear, not complete understanding of at what threshold smoke exposure can cause taint in grapes. And there is wonderful research being done by Anita Oberhoster at UC Davis and in Australia as well, but we still don't have a completely clear picture of how smoke taint works. And so unfortunately, the way crop insurance is structured, you only get covered if you can get a lab test that comes back showing a presence of volatile phenolic compounds that are attributed to smoke taint prior to the grapes being harvested. So, there was basically, unfortunately, there was basically only one lab at the time that was capable, early on at least, that was capable of doing these tests, which meant that with the disaster so widespread across the valley, results were delayed by 30 to 60 days. So this meant that people had to make picking decisions during harvest without adequate information about whether or not, smoke taint compounds, not even smoke taint, would be present in the grapes themselves, and if whether or not they would be covered by crop insurance, even if they had crop insurance. And so many wineries were inclined to mitigate this risk by either, choosing to kind of back out of contracts, which is sort of within, that's a legal question, but in some cases was within the confines of their contract for disaster kind of reasons, or they were, they took grapes at a very reduced cost, which goes back to what Dr. Smith was saying about the Grape Crush report and pricing that's reflected in the Grape Crush report. So this put a lot of pressure, obviously, on relationships between grape buyers and sellers, wineries and growers. And that was, again, exacerbated by the delayed lab results and not clearly defined parameters for ascertaining if grapes have been tainted. So looking forward, how do we mitigate this during potential future events? We have to advocate for better crop insurance policies for grape growers, and we also should probably continue to support as much as we can more research on smoke exposure and smoke taint, not only with regard to how it impacts the grapes themselves, but also in the processing. Are there ways that we can remove smoke taint compounds during winemaking process? Because that would take a lot of pressure off of the relationships and off of the need to make kind of decisions like the ones that had been made this year during harvest. And, just again, of the wines that will be made, of the wines that were made in 2020, the ones that will make it to the market they're going to be high quality and certainly memorable, memorable and reflecting a sense of resilience. So I'm optimistic about the ones that will make it out there.
Yeah, definitely. We're all anxious to try them, certainly. So looking back, were there certain varieties or certain regions of the valley that were more affected than others by wildfire and smoke taint in 2020?
Yeah, so to dive in more in terms of what is smoke taint, I'm actually going to pull up my slides. I forgot to pull one up earlier, and this is the one that I really wanted to show. I'm more of a talker than a slide sharer anyway. Okay, so in our circle here in Napa, we talk more about smoke exposure than we do smoke taint. And that's in part because there really, as I said before, there needs to be more research done to identify if smoke taint happens, how smoke taint occurs. We do know that smoke exposure led to significant damage to our grape crop this year, and the damage was really widespread, but also super variable. I actually borrowed this particular content for this slide from one of our board of directors, Garrett Buckland. He consults over kind of a wide part of the valley and has a really good lens through which to look at overall impacts to Napa County. So what is smoke taint? It's volatile phenol compounds in wildfire smoke. And we look at 13 main compounds, and there's a few of them listed right here. And these are the ones that are hypothesized to cause issues with winemaking. And they can impact wines at extremely low thresholds. So we're talking about parts per billion, which means, Garrett puts it as, it's the equivalent of like 1 sugar cube in an Olympic-sized swimming pool, or 1 second over 32 years. And that is the threshold at which an entire vintage could be, ruined, or not, which is the thing that is so, which drives people a little bit crazy, is that sometimes you can have presence of these compounds, but it doesn't affect the wines at all, which means, to a certain degree, these tests that are required by crop insurance are not meaningless, but they're not as conclusive as you would really like them to be. So again, very grateful for the work being done currently at UC Davis to understand this a lot better, because we really don't know how smoke taint interacts with grapes yet. And so, just to point out these photos here, in one of these photos, the grapes are smoke tainted, and the other one they're not. It's the same vineyard and the same harvest date. So, this question of proximity, I think that's something we still want to understand better, and how I think we really want to understand how the compound works better, because it's even within the same block, you can have grapes that are, considered to be tainted and others that are not. And so, there's a lot of steps that go into figuring that out before the wine gets bottled. And it's very standard for winemakers to, set aside, barrels based on block anyway. So, things don't get completely blended together until later in the process, and lots get removed if they seem to, express or lab tests show that there's a problem. So, but looking at the photos on the slide, there's a lot unknown.
Yeah, definitely. So if we put wildfires and kind of smoke taint aside, I think we'd all agree that 2020 will probably go down in history as the year of COVID-19, right? And so how, in the wake of the pandemic with state and regional stay-at-home orders, how has that reshaped Napa's wine industry? And the second part of that question would be, do you think those changes will persist over time?
So this is probably the question I maybe have the least to say about, but certainly wineries have implemented new DTC models, and there's been a lot of Zoom tastings, and for me, that's not really an area of expertise, but I do think that, for all of us, for myself included, we're probably going to try to carry things over into the post-COVID world that actually turned out to be silver linings, or worked well for us. And I think that the wine experience has a lot of really interesting ideas and models that have come about through this period of time. And from a viticultural standpoint, it's farmers' jobs to expect the unexpected, and they're constantly mitigating risk. And that risk could be related to wildfire, it could be related to pest and disease, or it could be related to market demands, or, really no year is the same. And so this year was really hard, but I think we have challenges all the time. And so we learn to be, resilient and reactive and proactive in terms of mitigating those risks. One thing I think is a little bit interesting that I've heard now a couple of times, and this was starting after 2017, it's a little bit fringe, but I want to throw it out there because I think there's a broad audience on here, is that I've heard about implementing certain viticultural techniques that would try to push harvest dates a little bit earlier. So things like pruning at certain times, would that help to allow growers to pick earlier? And in that sense, we are giving the vines a little bit of respite from possible, heat waves and fire exposure or smoke exposure, and other factors that kind of tend to happen later into harvest for the most part. So I think that's really interesting. That's the kind of research that I'm going to be tracking as well. And then I do want to kind of go back to the pricing that was meant, the sort of challenges surrounding pricing that Dr. Smith mentioned, because we are seeing lower pricing in the Grape Crush Report, and the Grape Crush Report is very significant from the standpoint of contracts. Traditionally here in Napa, a lot of growers will use the weighted average plus 10% for their contracts every year, or they'll figure out which percentile they're in and they'll increase by 10%. And so prices have historically continued to go up. I suspect, and this would be interesting to talk about Dr. Smith, but I suspect that the grape pricing, the lower prices won't actually persist for very long here in Napa. And that's partially because with so many companies that either didn't make wine or didn't make as much wine, there is going to be a production gap that needs to be filled. And then the other factor is the dry season we're having. And so we're expecting lower production, or lower growth this year and lower yields. So overall, I think the demand is going to continue to be strong, even with the current volatility. And we can anticipate strong prices moving forward, and not just for Cabernet, but probably for all of our other varieties as well. But I'm not the economist. That's sort of from my on the ground perspective, knowing what I know about contracts.
Yeah, definitely. So you mentioned one already, but my final question for you is how grape growers and wineries in the region are preparing for the future, and what steps are being taken that may kind of alter the future of the industry.
Yeah, and I think this is where we can go back to climate resilience and kind of the importance of mitigation. Napa is known for its ag preserve. We had the first ag preserve in the country. And we have this strong desire for agricultural permanence. And so to me, that means that our entire existence as an agricultural region relies on climate resilience. And not only do we need to talk about vineyard mitigation strategies, but we also need to talk about just adapting to everything that we're facing. We've been talking a lot about, ecosystem services, which are direct and indirect contributions to ecosystems, to people and planet, of ecosystems to people and planet, that can have a major role in mitigating climate change. And so agricultural land has inherent climate benefits compared to other land uses. And the vineyards in particular have huge capacity to act as carbon sinks if farmed in a way that allows for that. So, we're looking into how can we maximize those inherent benefits of the vineyard landscape from a climate perspective and a carbon sequestration perspective. And, even though Napa Valley represents like a really tiny slice of the problem and the solution, I think, we have the ability to build models here that might be able to be implemented in other regions. And, globally, I think, Dr. Smith kind of hinted at this, but there's a lot of ag land out there that could be utilized, right? So there's 18 million acres of vineyards and 11% of the planet is covered in farmland. And that's a huge untapped climate mitigation resource. I would love to see whole communities looking at farmland as a means of offsetting carbon footprint and using preservation of ag land as a climate mitigation strategy. And some of the things that we're doing here, we're producing content on building healthy soils and organic soil matter, permanent cover cropping strategies, compost, planting native hedgerows and increasing biodiversity, reducing vineyard waste and environmental practices for handling waste, reduction of water use, habitat restoration, monitoring soil carbon, monitoring and evaluating fuel use, and hopefully we'll have some electric tractors on the market soon, and hopefully ones that are driverless, so that that helps take some pressure off of some of the workforce. And then workforce transportation solutions. We also just embarked this past year on a 3-year trial in partnership with Oakville Station and UC Davis and Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and it's focused on soil health and climate. Basically, the basis of it is that climate change and soil health are some of the largest issues that we're facing. And so the goal is to generate real metrics for Napa Valley growers who are looking to assess their current practices. And so we're really excited to get results from that, even preliminary results, and start giving people, taking the science. Again, we love to take the science and the theory and make it something that we can turn into practice here in Napa.
Great. Thank you so much, Molly. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Mehdi, who will moderate the question and answer portion that comes from the webinar audience.
Thank you, Tina. Thanks for the great discussion, Molly and Dr. Smith. We have a list of questions here. I'm going to start with Dr. Smith, but if you think that I posed the question, but if either of you think that you can add more, just feel free to jump in after the other one finishes. So the first question is about the figure you presented, Aaron, in the beginning of your presentation, and you showed that the U.S. Compared to some of other countries. So the question is about how U.S. stands in terms of value compared to these other countries, and are those other countries also facing some of the same challenges that we are facing here in California, which can be representative in the value in terms of quality of the wine?
Good question. I don't actually have off the top of my head numbers for total value of wine production in California versus, say, in all of France or Italy. I guess I could Google that, or maybe Molly knows the number. But I mean, certainly, when you think about high value wines in the world, you certainly do think of Napa Valley, along with thinking of various parts of France and other parts of Europe and other parts of the world. But so there certainly is a lot of high value wine produced in each of these places. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess I would speculate that probably overall average value of the wine in the US is probably higher, because I think there's less, sort of relatively less bulk wine that is produced for local consumption. The other part of the question now I forget, but I think there was a second part of the question.
Yes, so it's about the challenges that these other major producing countries are facing. Are those similar, like probably the climate change, but how about the wildfires and other things that we are facing here in California? Yeah,
I mean, you certainly see Australia dealing with severe wildfire issues, and it's in California is similar. So, I think places that have, sort of large, very long dry seasons, as we do here, where we just don't get rain for a significant portion of the year. Australia similarly. Most of the wine growing regions in Europe don't have that same worry. So sort of wildfire risk there is not as high. So that particular risk now, but climate change is it's a global thing, and it affects different parts of the world differently. And so I don't know about studies particularly looking at wine and climate change in Europe, but there's been studies, for example, in grain production in Europe, and you see similar sorts of effects there, where you get more extreme heat that's going to affect yields negatively, and I would expect that's true for wine grapes there as well, but I don't know the specific studies.
Perfect. Thank you. And here's another one for both of you, is that how do we expect in the future about the federal and the state disaster relief programs as we see more and more wildfires and droughts hitting the wine industry in California? Do you have any sort of ideas or discussions about these disaster reliefs, like those that we have for corn and soybeans in the other parts of the country?
I'll start by answering that. I'm sure Molly has something to contribute. I mean, crop insurance is something that exists and has for a long time in the United States, run through the Risk Management Agency at USDA, expanded relatively recently to include more than just the big program crops of sort of corn, soybeans, wheat. I think often, and Molly had some really good examples, I think often the crop insurance is not adequate for sort of these really acute disasters that that we have, and so you often end up with sort of additional ad hoc government aid on top of that. And ideally, you want a system where people can plan in advance and insure against these outcomes, and then make decisions based on it. That's sort of the ideal world system. It's really hard, and I think there were sort of some motivations in setting up the crop insurance program were to try to achieve that, so that you avoid all this sort of ad hoc disaster relief where people, maybe behave in a way where they know that they're going to get bailed out if there is a disaster. But in practice, that just doesn't really seem to work very well, I think, because a lot of disasters are things that are not predicted by the particular payout structure of the crop insurance program, and so they maybe tie it to, as Molly was saying, things that you can't easily measure or something, and so it doesn't really mitigate the risk. And so I think there's always going to be government's always sort of the last resort to help people out, and I think that will continue, and it's often not well targeted. I think it's something for people working in policy to continue to work on, is to try to target relief to those who need it, and often it ends up being maybe more than enough for some groups and less than is needed for other groups, and it's hard to get that right, but I think that's so those details really can matter.
Yeah, I think that was, I totally agree with everything you just said, Dr. Smith. And I think another aspect of the kind of limitations of crop insurance for grape growers is that it's really built for kind of more commodity crops. Its original intention was for commodity crops, and then it got expanded to these more like specialty crops. And so even, for other types of disasters as well, no matter what type of disaster it is, if it's frost or something else, it doesn't give you the full market value of what you would have had. It assumes that there would have been loss anyway, because in other commodity crops there is more of a annual loss. With grapes, not so much. Like, you don't expect to lose 20% of your crop every year. That's not built in. And so, for people that were able to get coverage, the ones that had crop insurance and got a lab test that showed eventually after 60 days that there was a presence of these compounds and they were able to get compensated for that, they still didn't get compensated for everything. It's, so it really is, it's built on, I think, it's built on indicators that really aren't well understood and aren't easy to test for. And so you can test for smoke taint and you can see that it has levels of those phenolic compounds and the wine could be fine. Or you could test for it and the phenolic compounds don't show and then the wine isn't fine. And so the fact that crop insurance in this case is based on that is really quite problematic. And then crop insurance as a whole, I think only about 60% of growers in Napa County currently have crop insurance, which is actually high compared to other agricultural regions. It's another cost, and it's a cost which hasn't been shown to kind of completely pay itself back. That said, we work really hard to encourage growers to get crop insurance, to be as covered as possible. It's, overall, it's the best practice thing to do is to make sure you have crop insurance. So yeah, we really rely on federal relief, and that hasn't really come through for grapes that were smoke tainted. I mean, there's definitely been like FEMA relief if you had damaged property, but for damaged vineyards, it's been a real maze for people trying to find support for damaged vineyards. And a lot of the grant money that's currently out there for things like fire prevention for future wildfires, it has to be run through entities like UC Davis or our Resource Conservation District or CAL FIRE. There isn't a whole lot for individuals to apply for right now. So we're trying to do a lot of advocacy to say we really need to have more disaster relief funding and fire prevention funding for individual property owners. It's not a whole lot out there. It's a little bit bleak.
Just maybe one thing I could add there. I mean, sort of market-based risk management, like sort of, insurance products or, people trade in futures markets and things like that on some commodities. Those work really well for commoditized products. So if everybody's producing the same thing, then you can sort of pool that risk across a lot of people and design a product that's going to work for everyone. It's much harder when you face a very individual and distinct risk, and the grapes that are produced in Napa Valley are very much not commoditized, and so that's sort of a place where it's just hard to design a product that works, that is cost effective and works well. I mean, just so because every grower's situation is going to be different, so it's much closer to sort of some of the individual health insurance or something that we might get if it was tied to sort of our own health risk. Is like every person is unique, and so to offer that product is very expensive because you have to evaluate each grower separately because they're producing a different variety or it has a different brand or whatever, and so it's risk management is harder when the products are much more heterogeneous.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both. There's a related question, and you covered this a little bit, but I ask it if you have anything else to add. Have you seen the crop insurance for coverage for wine grapes increase during these past few years, and either in terms of growers going and insuring their crops, and also the premium for the insurance?
Yeah, maybe Dr. Smith knows numbers better. I wish I should have known this kind of question would come up, but so I don't know the exact answers to what percentage of increase. I do know that, yes, more people are getting crop insurance. I don't know what percentage that is. I suspect the premiums are higher. And it's, potentially even if we kind of set crop insurance aside from a liability and property insurance standpoint, it's getting harder and harder for people to even get insurance at all. People are being denied insurance. So it's, that's a huge problem. We have multi-levels of insurance questions and advocacy to work on.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't, even though I'm in California, I could probably have answered that question if it were about corn and soybeans, but it's on my list of things to do is to actually understand how these products are working in California.
Yeah, thank you both. So to move away a little bit about from insurance, and there are questions about preparation for droughts and wildfires. So here's a question that says, how would you recommend growers prepare for droughts and wildfire? Is that a transition either in terms of variety and location, or are there other best scenarios like that growers can set with even the varieties and locations they are in right now?
Yeah,
that makes sense.
We're actually, it's interesting timing. We're in a replanting phase here. Just a lot of vineyards are being pulled and replanted, and that has to do with, a lot of vineyards were planted kind of in the 80s, and sort of like vines can be in the ground for longer, certainly, but I think people are looking to make sort of changes at this time that are more climate friendly and more fire resilient. And so you can do things, the types of best practices that we're working on developing content for are related to things like fuel load reduction on properties, how to incorporate fire breaks onto your properties, cover cropping strategies to reduce kind of fuel loads in your vineyard and increase kind of moisture levels, irrigation, how that factors in. There's a lot of different aspects of how you can work on your property to make it more fire resilient. And it's sort of like home hardening, only you're looking at it from this vineyard landscape.
And do you have some sort of best practices that you would recommend to the wine grape operations or operations, if anything?
Yeah, those are, yeah. So some of the things I just listed, you know, and they're not, you know, they're in process right now. So we've been working on developing them, and you know, once they're developed, they're, you know, more widely available to growers here in Napa County and on our website. But again, it's, you know, I don't think that there's a lot of information out there about reducing fuel loads on home properties, but there aren't too many resources about how to adequately reduce fuel loads on vineyard properties. So we want to create a farm plan of sorts for people looking to mitigate fire on their property. A lot of vineyards that were affected were obviously close to forested areas. And so, you know, working with groups like the Resource Conservation District to develop forest management plans. Those can be very expensive. Mitigating, you know, like kind of taking out trees and underbrush on really steep hill slopes, but it's sort of necessary work that needs to be phased in over time. And so, you know, we want to help people figure out what the priorities are in that regard, you know, where to start, help support things like expanding chipping programs. The county here currently has a chipping program where you can get on a list and then they come out with their machinery and equipment and they can help do that chipping for free, which has been really helpful for growers. But yeah, I think cover cropping could be something we need to talk about. Cover cropping strategies, irrigation, fire resilient plants and hedgerows, fire breaks, integrating fire breaks onto the properties. Those are all the types of best practices that we'll be kind of developing.
Thank you very much. Yeah. And so this is a question that talks about, aside from the smoke taint, what are some of other effects of extreme weather and climate change on wine quality? Yeah.
I would have to let Molly answer that. She's going to be much more authoritative on wine quality than I am, I think.
So just in general, what are types of effects that could impact wine quality?
Yeah, from extreme weather and climate change, kind of. That comes
from climate change. Yeah. So I mean, again, we have seen a dry year this year. So, you know, vines are, you know, they have strong roots. You know, they're not like other crops that need to be replanted every year. They've weathered a lot of storms and a lot of dry spells. But, you know, I think we are looking at the impacts on the kind of like the long-term viability of some of the grapevines we have. Like how are the rootstocks that we're currently using doing with this dryness? Do we need to look into different types of rootstocks for people that are in replanting phases? Water use is a big deal. I mean, irrigation, not everybody irrigates, but a large number of people do small amount of irrigation. And so we need to be looking at how we can reduce water use in the vineyard. And again, rootstocks, there are certain rootstocks that are kind of built for less water, maybe dry farming. How we manage soil. Again, this vineyard trial that we're doing, I think is going to be really important because we're going to look specifically at different practices, different soil management practices, and how, you know, I love this design for this trial because it's about carbon sequestration and soil health, but it's also taking quality into account because we're not going to see farmers implementing changes in the vineyard if there's too much risk to quality and too much risk to the fruit. So we have to be sure that whatever we're doing that's going to be climate positive and climate smart is going to not negatively impact quality and perhaps even increase quality in vineyards. And so that's the the lens through which, you know, we're looking at it. And I think we've had such promising data so far that I think we're going to see we're going to get some really interesting feedback from that trial and practices that will be good on a lot of different levels.
Thank you. And just related to that, and there's a question about carbon sequestration. It says what we can do as grower industry association and the government to support simultaneous wildfire risk reduction and carbon sequestration through composting or biochar production using local woody feedstocks. Right now, there is a disconnection between these two.
Let's see, right now, wildfire reduction, carbon sequestration. Yeah, so it's interesting. We just signed a joint letter with a number of other agricultural industry associations across the state and also environmental groups. So groups like Nature Conservancy and Pacific Forest Group and other healthy forest oriented groups, as well as Cattlemen's Association and other grape associations across the state in advocating for more funding for fire prevention work to be done throughout the state. And I think what's been really encouraging and interesting to me is that kind of what's good for mitigating risks for wildfires is also good for maintaining healthy forests. I mean, there's just an obvious linkage between, you know, wildfires aren't good for the severity of wildfires. You know, natural wildfire in an ecological landscape is one thing, but the severity of wildfires is not currently good for forests and wildlife, and it's not good for, you know, farming and communities. And it's we've really been able to band together with all these different groups to kind of bring those causes together. And I'm not sure if that totally answered the question, but the disconnect, you know, if there's disconnect between, you know, work that has to be done for wildfire prevention and for carbon sequestration, I think wildfire prevention is climate resilience work, in my opinion. And, you know, other types of work like composting and biochar, definitely very interested in those things. A lot of people implement compost, especially here, and I've seen an uptick in interest in looking at biochar and how it, as a product, it's really great, and as a technique for getting rid of woody debris, it's really great. And so I think we're learning more about whether or not it can be utilized in the vineyard, and if that's beneficial in the vineyard, and certainly beneficial in other types of farming landscapes. I don't know if Dr. Smith has more to add.
I think that's a good point, that wildfire prevention is itself carbon positive. And sort of generally, when I think you look at these challenges, the type of coordination is a little different in the sense that, you know, anybody who might be potentially affected by a wildfire directly around here has an incentive to coordinate with each other. You know, if you can make sure that land and forests are being better managed that are near your property, then that obviously helps you. So there's that more sort of local coordination, whereas, you know, climate in some sense requires global coordination. So you are, I think, going to see sort of just different layers of policy interest there, but they certainly interact, like as Molly said. And I think it's certainly, you know, in the current Biden administration, you hear a lot of talk about how there's going to be a lot of initiatives and incentives for sort of carbon positive farming techniques, and I don't really know how that's going to work, and I think in many cases I'm perhaps a little skeptical about how it's going to work, because I think there could potentially be a lot of things that they might pay for that are not really actually going to work. You know, perennials like grapes and almonds seem like much better sequesters of carbon than maybe things where you have an annual crop and you're tilling the soil. But there's a lot of challenges, I think, to doing that right. But I think there is going to be a lot of federal interest in ways to promote carbon sequestration on farms.
Thank you. And here is a final question. And Dr. Smith mentioned in his slides that the droughts are getting frequent and also more intense. And we have, the state announced there is a new drought for 2021. The wildfires are getting more frequent and intense. Plus, we had COVID, so there's a lot of different challenges that hitting the industry probably. What would be your take-home message for both policymakers and regulators, and anything that you want the audience to know, and conclude your your discussion for today?
My take-home message, I don't know. I mean, there's people really like California wine. So, I think we can speak a lot about the challenges, and there are a lot of challenges. And I think, as Molly said, farmers are always seeing and facing challenges. I grew up myself on a farm in New Zealand. We had sheep to fit the stereotype, but it's the same thing sort of around the world in agriculture. So, I think farmers are very cognizant of risk and challenges and figuring out ways to meet those challenges. And so, I tend not to be sort of too pessimistic, even though some of these challenges that I talked about are really big. I mean, it's even for people like me who's, not directly affected by the wildfires we've experienced for the most part over the last, sort of multiple years, it's still no fun, right? And so if you think then about the people who really are directly affected because their property or their livelihoods are getting affected, that's those are big challenges. But I think the other side, it's important to also realize that people like California wine, and so I think that's something that the state and the producers across the whole spectrum, I think not just Napa, but also producers in other parts of the state should feel proud of and motivated to keep moving forward.
Yeah, my one other thing I'd love for people to take away is kind of going back to the fact that I really think ag preservation and climate resilience are inherently linked, and that they serve one another. So we're not able to farm without protecting our climate. We won't be able to continue farming without protecting. That's on a very broad level, not just here in Napa Valley. But we can also become more resilient through preservation of agriculture. And so I think when we're talking about advocacy, again, I would love to see government be more supportive of preservation of agriculture as a climate mitigation strategy, and supportive of supporting individual landowners in making changes to their practices that are more climate smart.
Thank you very much, both of you. This was a great discussion. Definitely, I learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone appreciate your presentation. I turn it to Ellen to conclude and talk about the next webinar. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mehdi, and thank you again to Molly and Aaron. I'm just going to give a heads up for our next webinar, which will be on May 11th. The theme is citrus, and we're going to talk about citrus greening, or HLB, which is like one of the most serious citrus plant diseases in the world, and it's something that's impacted the citrus industry in Florida really heavily, and it's a threat in California. And so we're going to have Dr. Ariel Singerman, who's at the University of Florida, talk about the impacts to the citrus industry in Florida. And then we're going to have Dr. Bruce Babcock from UC Riverside to talk about what it means for California and the role that citrus plays in the California economy. So look forward to that. Mark your calendar, May 11th. And you can always visit our website at areadiscussions.ucdavis.edu to subscribe to our mailing list, to register to future events, and access all the recordings from past webinars. So thank you all, everyone, for joining, and thank you again to our great speakers for today. See you all next time.